Today's video is a bit different from some of my previous videos. I want to do a bit more of a long form discussion of one of the features of Vadi's fencing text, which is sometimes referred to as the Segno. I've got a few videos coming up in the Vadi by the Source series, which is linked below if you want to check it out, that reference bits from this part of the text, and it can be a bit confusing what we're talking about, so I wanted to have just a bit more of a broad discussion about what it is and sort of how it's used and why it's important in Vadi's fencing system. So the name it's normally given is called the Segno. It's not, this name doesn't appear in Vadi's work. It's something which has been given after the fact by sort of HEMA scholars and is used similarly for a similar but not identical image that's used as part of Fiore's work. And the short version of it is, it's an image of a man standing with a sword. Different parts of the body have some kind of metaphorical, allegorical, whatever you want to call it, image that's related to the body part. And then there's a short stanza of a short sort of 2 to 4 lines that give something about that body part or the image, or normally both. So I'll read an example. One example is I am, this is for the left shoulder, has an image of a ram. I am the ram, always on the lookout, that by my nature seeks to clash. Like so, it will help your cuts to be cunning, to always parry when they are answered. Fairly cryptic. I would say none of Vadi's stuff is super clear. This is probably the least clear, in many cases, of anything in Vadi's work. However, having said that, it's clearly very important to him. So this image appears in an almost identical fashion, probably slightly more detailed, nearly 30 years before Vadi's work is written in 1457. Centuries were important, on a bronze medallion that was cast. And this is one of the few other sort of physical artifacts we have that we can clearly link to Vadi. So in 1457 in Venice, this bronze medallion is cast. On one side it shows Vadi's face, and on the other it shows this exact image. I used to think it was not exactly the same image, but the V&A have a copy of this medallion that is much, and they've now produced a much higher resolution image than I've seen before. And if you zoom very closely into it, you can see every single one of the devices on this image, on the Segno from the book, appear in some way, shape or form on this bronze medal. The medals are about sort of yay big, right? They're not super big. And these medals in that period were used essentially as very posh business cards, right? So a person would get them cast for themselves, and the idea was it would show something about who they were, and they would give it to wealthy patrons and say, basically, here's my details, remember me by it. So as I say, very posh, quite expensive business cards. The particular medalist that produced this, Giovanni Boldu, generally speaking, did stuff for kind of tradesmen and well-to-do middle-class folks, essentially. There were some that were done for the nobility. It started with the nobility in Ferrara, but this one was particularly specialized for middle-class folk. So this is an image which has had very much a history for Vadi, right? 30 years before he writes his text, or nearly 30 years, depending on when we date it, this is already something which is kind of core to his identity, that he's using to say, this is who I am, this is what I do. In Vadi's work, it appears, so the way that the book is constructed, it's a bunch of different bindings, right? And it's not clear whether they were all together or they were all separate. This Segno appears at the start of a binding, right? So what we have is we have one binding that has all the text sections to it, ends with the word telos, the end, and then a new binding starts, and it starts with this image. So if they were separate books, I'm not necessarily saying they are, when it can't be certain. Some people think definitely they were, some people think definitely they weren't. But if they were separate books, this was essentially the cover piece that says, okay, this is, again, everything that I'm about to talk about. And actually what's interesting is, if you look at chapter 3 in the text section, I didn't notice this until fairly recently, but basically all of the concepts that appear here appear in chapter 3, which is the first chapter that goes into fencing theory, right? Before that, we've got one which talks about whether fencing is an art and a science, and one that talks about the construction of a sword. The first meaty fencing advice is in chapter 3, and again, all of these things appear there, right? So this is a set of concepts that kind of we see like a golden thread of them coming through everything that we can think about Vadi having worked on. This Segno is kind of important. Now when I first started Vadi, skipped over it, I will confess, because it is very flowery. You know, you've got this imagery, it's the dragon or it's the sun, and, you know, linked to the left hand. It's not really clear what the body parts are doing. Are they giving you specific biomechanical advice? Is it saying, yeah, use your left hand for this? Or is it just kind of a flowery, the left hand is something, you know? So it can't be very clear. But it's important. So skipping over it was a bad plan. There's a few ways that we can kind of start tackling it as sort of HEMA practitioners that we're considering. For me, I think the basic way we should look at this diagram is a way of presenting a bunch of very important but not necessarily consistent fencing concepts that we need to try and apply in our fencing. Right? What I say not necessarily consistent, some of them are directly opposed from each other, and it's kind of hard to see how they would relate. For instance, the devices for the sun and the wheel talk about changing foot a lot, so moving in and out and changing foot, whereas the sun is for the right foot, the legs are, and the wheel is for both legs. Whereas the castle, which is attached to the left leg, talks about standing firm and staying solid. You can't really move in and out and stay solid at the same time. So they're very interesting in the sense that these are sort of things that we should try out in our fencing and apply to the right circumstance, which of course he doesn't tell us what that is. But they give us these sort of core concepts to apply again and again and again. And it's interesting, for instance, that it starts at the top with the compasses and the head. And what's the important thing there? It's to measure your tempo, to understand your tempo, to understand your opponent's tempo, and this sort of combination of measure and tempo, which we see throughout the text. So it's very worth spending some time with it, looking at these things, thinking about them and how to apply them. One interesting exercise that I've done before, and I think works really well for a bunch of reasons, is to take this Segno. What I've done is I've cut up each element into a separate sort of little card. So you take one element at a time and put them in a hat or an envelope. And then what happens is the two fences are going to basically spar, but each of them takes one or more, depending on how ambitious you are, of these cards, reads it, comes up with their own interpretation of it, and tries to apply it in fencing in the sparring match with their opponent. And they are tasked with both fencing in that way and trying to understand and read their opponent and work out, which one is the opponent doing. This is a really interesting exercise, right? I did it as a bit of fun, and it's actually ended up being one of my favorite exercises. It's interesting for a bunch of reasons, all of which are HEMA relevant. The first is that everybody comes up with a very different interpretation, and when you look at them, they're all quite valid. And sometimes I've seen two students come up with completely different interpretations that are not only valid for what it says in the Segno, but they're also valid in terms of when you think about applying it to different areas of the book and how it relates to the wider fencing system. So I think this kind of multi-purpose, multi-use, multi-description aspect of it is probably intentional. I think James Rand once said that, who's a person who's worked on a Vadi interpretation over in Australia. He once said to me that he thinks that where Vadi is ambiguous, probably it's because he meant all of those ambiguous meanings, he meant them all at the same time. And I think this is one area where you can really kind of feel that might be true. So that's interesting from a historical perspective. The other interesting thing from a fencing perspective is it really forces people to kind of get out of their comfort zone and change things out. And it practices reading an opponent who's doing something weird, which is very difficult when you're fencing in a club, because people do kind of similar things and you don't really have to read your opponent, they're doing something. So it's a very good thing to look at from your own perspective, to read, sort of try and apply. Even if you're not doing an exercise, just trying to think, okay, well, today I'm going to be like the bear, I'm going to hunt. Or today I'm going to be like the lamb, I'm going to clash. And to get out of your own comfort zone. It's very good from an exercise perspective for practicing reading your opponent and adapting your fencing according to a specific thing. But in general, I think we do need to treat it as Segno, which means sign, as the signpost for a lot of the other things that Vadi says. As I say, everything in it, I didn't realize this until relatively recently, but everything in it appears earlier in the text in some way, shape or form. Most of it in chapter 3, and then a lot of it repeats multiple times in other locations as well. So it really is the key, the core to unlocking Vadi's system, despite it being very flowery. And I think me in particular, and others as well, probably skip over it because of this flowery nature, but that is a mistake. So some of the videos where in the Vadi by the source are going to be referencing aspects of this. You get to see my interpretation. They should be coming out, I think they're scheduled for end of May. They'll give you an opportunity to see some of this in practice when that comes out. But I would encourage you to look at the Segno yourself if you're studying Vadi, have a play with it, see what you can get out of it, see what you can interpret from it, because it is actually much more interesting than it first appears when you just look at it and see a bunch of images and kind of get unstuck. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it.